Hello! It's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Alberta Provincial Election Forecast Update. Now, today I have just a few channel update notes. So I have been running, when I have ideas and thoughts, some market research polls in the community tab in the channel. If you are interested in those, keep an eye out and by all means vote in them when I post them. As a result of the most recent one of these, though, what I'm going to be doing going forward is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my currently unutilized upload slots that I have used in the past, which in the future I will be using again for actual content when I have reasons to put stuff in them. But in the meantime, when there is no better videos to put in them, in the weeks preceding an election update like this one, I'm going to be taking clips from it, maybe not the same clips from every single video, and I'm going to be posting them again on those days, shorter clips. So instead of, you might see this on other shows like the Lotus Eaters or like a Daily Wire show, something like that, where they will have segments of their show as a separate video. That is something I'm going to be doing. It looks like a lot of people are interested in that, and I think it will help make a lot of this more digestible, because some of these videos can be long. I'm going to try this out. If you don't like it, let me know, but this will not be subtracting from normal content. I otherwise would not be using these slots. So that is just the forewarning. And now let's get into Alberta. Now, to start with, this is... So Alberta's an interesting election. So the thing with Alberta here is the UCP is a new party. It's really only existed since maybe 2018, maybe 2017, but in that range. And it was created out of merging of the PCs and the Wild Rose Party. Very similar to the Reform Party and the PCs federally making the Conservative Party. Now, what makes this interesting is who does this party track for historical performance. We have polling data, robust polling data going back to 2008. We have robust regional performance records going back to early 2000s for the main parties in this election. So we have a good idea of how these have trended and how they have done historically, which in other models, in other elections, I use to help constrain the forecast. Because if you just do a naive proportional swing, you will get weird results. For example, you do Alberta at large, in the most simple form of a naive proportional swing, and you swing this 13 points NDP, a lot of rural Alberta starts looking orange or competitive. No one at all thinks that's the case. In small city / rural Alberta, there's really just Banff, Kanaskus, Lesser Slave Lake, and Lethbridge, which are meaningfully competitive, maybe Red Deer if you really want to push the definitions of competitive. But there's really no other places outside of Calgary and Edmonton that are competitive. But if you do a 13-point swing, some of these ridings do look vaguely competitive, and that's clearly not the case. So you have to put the constraining variables in place. What a lot of people do, and what I do, I have regional numbers to constrain it. I have demographic profiles where possible to constrain it, such as age, sex, education level, income level. Those are the main things you can get in polls in Canada. But in some races, there's really not any of this for Alberta, but the urbanicity I've also been using federally because I have the polling data to do it. I don't really have the polling data for urbanicity in Alberta, so I haven't been able to use it. There's been maybe like 1 or 2 polls with it, and that's just not enough. You need a sample of, I'm going to say like 10 plus polls, and preferably as many different pollsters as possible to make it valuable, or at least have very good pollsters with very good track record doing it, and we just don't have that in Alberta. But where this gets interesting is if you do what I have here. So I have 2 projections for you today, and if you watched my Twitter, you will notice earlier this week on Friday I did post 2 different maps. This map here, this is my main map. This is the one I am most confident in, because this is assuming the UCP continues on how it did in 2019, and it tracks the PCs beforehand. And if you look at the 2019 performance, you will agree that that assumption actually looks pretty reasonable. I will just bring up some raw data here. Bear with me. Okay, so this is pollster records since 2008. I couldn't really go much further back than that. I just don't have the data, and the way I calculate this internally, it really doesn't matter too much if you go much further back than that. And in some places like this, the Wild Rose Party didn't exist, so it's 1, and before this I'm using the Wild Rose Party. But anyways, we're going to look at the UCP here. So 2019, we have the UCP, and look at these numbers, right? So we're looking at, and just to give some context on this, 1 means that there is no bias. Less than 1 means it's an overestimated party, and greater than 1 means it's underestimated. In other words, it outperforms its vote share on election day. There's all sorts of reasons why this could be. Pollster error, fact pollsters don't really consider likely voters in Canada, differential turnout rates, etc. There's all sorts of possible reasons, but this is the historical performance records, right? So in 2019, we have these. And you look at these numbers, and you'll notice that they all have the UCP being overestimated, and it looks to be underestimated. And it looks like the UCP is underestimated by maybe 12%, let's say. And then you look back and you look at the other data, and you look at all of these, and you'll notice the pollsters are getting better, so that's good. But you'll also notice these numbers here look very similar to these numbers here. Especially if you look at, say, 2008, 2012, these numbers are very similar to these numbers. Whereas you look at the Wild Rose Party, which I'm using as the basis for the Wild Rose Independence Party, that could be a bad assumption, but it's a very brand new party, so who knows? And you'll see a very different thing. The Wild Rose Party was routinely overestimated in polls. In fact, on average, they got only like 90% of the vote that they were forecast to get. And that looks nothing like these numbers here. That's why in this scenario, I'm using PC numbers as the basis for the historical data for the UCP. Because the one election we have with the UCP, its track record and historical performances look very similar to the PC party. But it's not just polls. We also have past election results. Let me bring this up. And this is the regional biases, as you see here. So what this means is that the rest of Alberta votes 13 points to the right of the province at large. Calgary votes 2 points less UCP than the province at large, and Edmonton votes 16 points less. Okay. Look at these numbers. If you look at, say, 2015 or 2012 or 2008 or 2004. These are where we have good data for this. And you'll notice the same trend. They don't do very well in Edmonton. They usually do good in the rest of Alberta, except for the 2012 and 2015 elections where the Wild Rose really stole that thunder. But even then, the rest of Alberta is generally where they do the best. And they do in between in Calgary. And you look at the Wild Rose numbers. And it's similar, but the Wild Rose usually does actually pretty decent in Calgary. In not that bad in Edmonton. It's a bit fuzzy, but to me, this really looks like the PC numbers do track the UCP coalition okay. Which again is why I'm using this as the baseline for this. You can make arguments here and you can disagree. In fact, if you want to comment below if you see any patterns here or you want to make some arguments that I might not be considering, by all means, go ahead. I welcome them. But these are some assumptions that go into my model and why I get results like this. I'm not forecasting this result because I am some sycophantic Smith supporter. I'm forecasting this result because the assumptions that I make, which every single model and every single election, I use very similar assumptions. And these assumptions are based off of historical performances and historical data. So it's not me assuming things. This is just things that have happened in the past. But we have this other scenario here. And this one is what happens if the UCP tracks the Wild Rose Party. And I made a mistake here, seeing this. This should be 33, not 34. And this also does seem perfectly plausible. In fact, you might even argue this seems more realistic. 338 and Too Close to Call are actually pretty close to this. And what's the difference between this guy and this guy? The only difference is if we look at pollster records, I am using for pre-2019 the Wild Rose numbers, and for historical performance, I'm using pre-2019 Wild Rose numbers. I still use 2019 UCP data where it's available, but before that, I'm using the Wild Rose data. Now, there is another permutation I considered, but I dismissed because it really just puts somewhere the election between this outcome and the next outcome, which is to hybridize them, average the two results. But any form of average, weighted or otherwise, that I could do between the Wild Rose and the PC results, historical performance and pollster records, is just going to give an election result between this and this. I hope that's pretty clear. There's no world where I take doing better in Calgary and doing mediocre in Calgary and get worse performance. You can't get 1 and 2 and get less than either of those numbers. You can't add 2 numbers and get smaller. You can't average 2 numbers and get smaller than the smaller one. 1 plus 2 divided by 2 is 1.5. It's bigger than the smaller number. So any way I weight this, this is the bottom end, and this is the top end. And these are really the two scenarios we have here. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how? All of the polls are saying otherwise. The raw data is saying otherwise. How could you be forecasting this so consistently? Well, let's look at this. Here is the raw polling data. Nationally, not adjusted for regions, not adjusted for demographics. Though I do have all that data. And you'll see here, in this column, this is the UCP. And the UCP is either tied or trailing in every single poll for the most part. with the NDP. There's some exceptions like this Angus Reid poll here, but there's also negative exceptions like Janet Brown last October. So what gives? Well, when you take this data, and you take the regional data, and you take the demographic data, and you combine it with historical performances to constrain the polling numbers, and to account for potential polling error. And it's not just that the companies are wrong. It's that the companies are making certain assumptions, and those assumptions are usually proportional-ish turnout. That's not true. It's very, very possible that the turnout in Edmonton is really low, or equally extremely high. And in either of those scenarios, you're going to radically change the NDP numbers without changing their seats. If the turnout in Edmonton is halved, you're probably going to lose 5 points of NDP vote share without losing a single seat. Equally, if it's doubled, 100% turnout Edmonton, you're a lot likely to really gain any more seats in Edmonton for the NDP, but they might gain 5 points in vote share. Now, I'm not doing something that specific, but that is the general principle of what my adjustments do. And if you look at past elections, such as Quebec 2022 or Ontario 2022, my methodology here on my assumptions on polling performance and historical performance were very good. I had some other errors in Ontario that messed up my seat projections, specifically. Not my popular vote, not my regional vote. My seat projections were messed up in many cases. And in Quebec, because of niche interactions with my model, it didn't like basically Main Street dominating the polling. But if you factor those in and you account for that, my model performs better than it would have without these corrections. That's the important thing to consider. Now, the other thing here, and the really important thing with this election, is there isn't really... This is two different elections. Election 1 is the NDP election. The NDP have two jobs. They have to keep their base activated, and they have to discourage UCP turnout. The NDP cannot win a high turnout election. And in fact, they can't win a low turnout election. If you look all the way back at 2015, if just 36% of the PC voters voted Wild Rose, or vice versa, the NDP lost, assuming the rest of them didn't vote. So you could have phenomenally low turnout, phenomenally low, and the NDP lose. The NDP can win by nearly 100,000 votes in the popular vote and lose the election. Based on their historical performances, based on whether parties gaining strength, based on where they currently have numbers, they can win the popular vote and easily lose. And if we look at some of the raw data here, so this is the regional numbers. As you can see here, this is 2019. And this is one of the issues you have with the NDP's vote. So what we can see here is in the 2019 numbers, for example, they've gained 10 points in rest of Alberta. They've gained 10 points in a region where they really only have a couple of seats to gain. If we look here, they had 1 seat banned from, what was it, Westbridge East? West? Whatever. They had 1 seat in 2019, and right now they're still polling at 1 seat. But they really only had the capacity to pick up 3 seats, and they've gained 10 points there. And this is about approximately a third of Alberta, in rest of Alberta area. So a lot of their gain in vote share is completely worthless. Yes, the UCP's, and the other thing complementary to this, is a lot of the places the UCP's lost vote share from 2019, according to my model, either version of it, by the way, a lot of the places where they've lost vote share is the rest of Alberta, which is completely worthless. That doesn't matter to them. If rural Alberta turns out 30%, less, or it flips a little or a little NDP, that doesn't really matter. Doesn't really affect the outcome of the election at all. A 20-point swing in rural Alberta doesn't really get you many seats. And by the way, that might constrain this to be a bigger swing. But then you get places like Edmonton or Calgary, and you look at these, and in Calgary, the UCP's not really lost any votes, and in Edmonton, it's gained votes. The NDP has gained votes in both Edmonton and Calgary, but the Edmonton vote gains are basically worthless. And the Calgary ones are good for them, but it's not enough. They can't just lose Edmonton by 11. Calgary by 11. And I will be really clear, these are the census metropolitan areas, not the city per se. So an 11-point lead in Calgary for the UCP is not as big as it seems, because that is including a lot of parts that are not, that are more rural, if you will. And if you look at my Wild Rose version, you see a very similar trend, though it's a bit closer in Calgary, and that's why it's a closer election. But either way, a lot of the vote gain is super inefficient. And this is the fundamental problem the NDP has. Yes, they look like they're gaining votes, especially in the last election, and they probably have gained votes, to be fair. But it's not enough. And it really can't be enough. As of 2023, the bridge is insurmountable of their own accord. And that's why the NDP election campaign is about keeping this base engaged and motivated to vote. And then, equally, encouraging or discouraging turnout overall. That's why you are seeing Notley play this really funky game where she's simultaneously pretending to be centrist but not. She's dog whistling to her voters that, no, I'm actually not a centrist, I am an NDPer. But at the same time, she's trying to assuage centristy UCP voters. I'm not a big threat. You don't have to vote. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. Is it going to be successful? I can't tell you yet. I could be wrong. My assumptions could be wrong. But it's a very tough game to play. And that's her election campaign. That's it. Once the right drops, I would be very surprised if the NDP do anything but really attack ads. That's probably going to be their entire campaign. Their entire campaign is probably going to be based on character assassination of Smith. Because they can't gain voters. They don't need to do a positive campaign because they have no voters to gain. They're at their threshold. In fact, they've probably stretched their balloon almost to the breaking point. The party might not be able to survive when Notley eventually retires. You will see. But either way, it is as stretched as it can be right now, it seems. And I'm not the only one saying this. You look at Keto Maggie of Main Street Research. He has the same opinion that the NDP seems to be at their ceiling. And that should make sense to people. There isn't that many progressive voters yet in Alberta. That might change. Things change all the time. Generation turnover, immigration, interprovincial migration, emigration, deaths, just people changing their mind. All of these things happen and change the field. But for now, we should assume that hasn't changed enough in 4 years. And we have had 2 other elections since then, showing that Alberta is still safe conservative. Even a weak, dithering leader like O'Toole blew out Alberta. Provincial's not federal, sure. But the left-wing turnout federally wasn't low. It was higher than 2019. So it's not that O'Toole assuaged concerns of progressives in Alberta. It's more that the federal Conservative Party is better at getting out the vote. And here are some more details on this. Let's just resize this to be a bit cleaner. So right here we have the 2019 results. About 1 million UCP voters, 620 NDP, and others have others. Here I'm using the Alberta Independence Party and as the Wild Rose base numbers. And then we apply a vote switch based off of polling data. This is the unadjusted version. There is no polling error considered here. And if we assume that there's no net new voters, and I'm going to rephrase this, that the net new voters, the difference between the voters who have died / aren't voting and the ones who are now voting are indistinguishable. They are congruent. They are the same electorate as 2019. There's no differences. Not the best assumption in the world, but it's an okay assumption. We assume the net voter pool change is like this. Then the UCP wins easily based off of what we have for party defectors. And in some of these places, like some of these are wild because in reality, I don't actually have all of these, the smaller parties broken out in polling data. A lot of them are merged in together as other. Actually, I think most of these are merged in as other. And I can do some funny statistical stuff with Alberta Party because they have more data. But just take these as a block. Don't look at them individually and be like, hey, we're 56% of Alberta Independence Party voters going NDP. They're not. They're not. That's just a quirk of the data. But, so what we have here, right? Well, there's just, in a really good election, 781,000 votes. That is like 25% more than 2019. That's more by about 100,000 than 2021, which was a very high turnout for left-wingers in Alberta. They still decisively lose, and that's with the UCP losing 110,000. That's a huge loss. The UCP lost 110,000 voters That would be substantial in itself. That would already be newsworthy. And they still win decisively. Then we start looking at some different scenarios. So this is the easiest scenario. We assume just that 20% of the UCP electorate goes home, but my polling corrections are meaningful and useful. And if we assume that, then we get two things. We get the NDP's about 740, we get UCP's about 784, 3-point lead. UCP is still going to win. Because remember, the NDP needs about +2 popular vote with their current spread to win. And note, we're down nearly 300,000 voters overall. That's very substantial. And in fact, I would go further because I have calculated elsewhere what I suspect the NDP vote share will be. And I think it's going to be approximately 711,000. This is about 100,000 more than 2019. This is about 40,000 more than 2021. I think it's a very safe baseline. And if we take these percentages and we assume it's 711,000 for the NDP, we actually get even more or even slower turnout, down to 1.63 million from 1.7. This still is an NDP loss. 300,000 fewer voters in a province that has gained population. And they still lose. We go to this scenario, and this is if they track the Wild Rose Party. This one was Wild Rose Party 2. Tracking Wild Rose Party 2, sorry. And they track the Wild Rose Party, but otherwise there's no decrease in UCP turnout. And then we again fix it to 711,000 NDP voters. And we get about 1.78 million voters, and the UCP is about 900,000. Again, substantial loss, but a 10-point lead in the popular vote is a 10-point lead. They've won comfortably. And finally, the last real scenario we have here is this tracks PC numbers. There is no meaningful difference in turnout, or the UCP base is not meaningfully demoralized. It's just a general turnout thing. And then we're looking, again, fixing the NDP 711,000. We are looking at turnout of maybe 1.77 million, 914,000 UCP votes. That kind of deal. These seem to be the ballparks we're playing with. This is the ball game, if you will. And this is one of the reasons why the NDP really doesn't have a chance. Because again, even if we don't fix their results, they're very low. And even if we throw in new voters, how many new voters are there going to really be? Let's assume there's 100,000 new voters. Net new voters. Even if 100,000 new voters broke entirely NDP, there was 100,000 new NDP voters and no one else got a single new voter. In their best case scenario, right here, you're 784 to 838, UCP wins. You're 755 to 811, UCP wins. That's not enough of a lead. And in case you doubt me, bear with me here. Why did that? Oh, that's only 10,000. Well, I made a mistake there, but you get the drift. You get the deal. That's why the NDP's campaign is going to be about character assassination. Their only hope is that they make conservatives in Alberta hate Smith so much they don't vote. And this is where Smith, either intentionally or unintentionally, has cultivated herself a bulletproof shield. She's had so many silly, small scandals, so many gaffes, so many awkward things, so many stupid things. Why would you even say that to anybody? There isn't going to be traction on any of them anymore. There's nothing the NDP can really throw in a campaign now that is going to demoralize UCP voters. All that is left is that Smith and the UCP can encourage UCP voters by giving them red meat. You can't demoralize someone more than they've been demoralized. But you can remoralize somebody. You can rally them. But it's hard to make them more melancholic than they already are when they're melancholic. To give an example of this, there's a very recent, really dumb scandal that has popped up. It's the biggest nothing burger probably this year in Canadian politics. And that is, Danielle Smith had a call with Arthur Pawlowski, which he recorded and then posted on social media, where she was promising him that she would look into his case, the COVID charges being pressed against him, and that she would try to help him. Following this, Smith talked to the Crown Prosecutor, talked to the Minister of Justice, and looked for solutions. Not just to Arthur Pawlowski, but to all of the people who've been charged with COVID regulatory violations. Following this, she was told by the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, which I think are the same person, that she can't do anything. This is in the hands of the Crown, and it's the Crown's decision what to do, and that she, as the the Premier, has no capacity to change this. She cannot pardon them, if you will. Now, in principle, she could have passed a law retroactively, though it's still debatable whether that law would compel the Crown to prosecute underneath it. And it gets kind of fuzzy, but in principle, she had the power to do that, though she has not chosen to do this. And what the NDP, CBC, and generally the left wing in general in Canada, on election Twitter, for example, has been saying is, oh, this is the SNC-Lavalin scandal again. Danielle Smith did an SNC-Lavalin, and then she's toast, she's finished, it's the end. The end is nigh. It's not, though. This is nothing like SNC-Lavalin. It's superficially similar if you don't understand why SNC-Lavalin was a problem. But if you look in for 1 nanosecond about why SNC-Lavalin was an issue, why anyone cared about SNC-Lavalin, you realize it's not the same at all. So what happened in SNC-Lavalin? Since apparently lots of people have missed what the scandal was. So in SNC-Lavalin, there was a company, SNC-Lavalin, who is being charged with corruption that they did prior to 2015. My understanding is they were bribing the Libyan government for projects. I could be slightly mistaken there, but the general gist is they were caught bribing government officials overseas. That is illegal in Canada. So they were being prosecuted. Come 2018, when the prosecution really starts, because they committed the crime pre-2015, I want to say it was 2014, but they really only got caught in the 2017-ish range, and they started getting prosecuted in 2018. So Trudeau passed in an omnibus budget a law to change prosecution guidelines to allow prosecutors to do a deferred prosecution agreement with someone who's committed select crimes. In essence, this is a reduced sentence. It's less serious. Because if you are caught with corruption, you are banned from... Or under the current previous laws, if you're convicted for corruption, you are banned from government contracts and stuff like this. This would allow SNC-Lavalin to still do government contracting in Canada, among other places. Now, passing this law in and of itself is fine. It'd be the same thing if Smith passed a law to allow people who were charged with COVID regulatory violations to get reduced sentences or reduced charges. It's the same deal. Where this became an issue is he passed this law, and his Attorney General / Justice Minister, who is the same for sure federally, did not want to change prosecution. Wilson-Raybould wanted to keep charging SNC-Lavalin as a corruption case, and seek conviction underneath that, and not get a deferred prosecution agreement. Trudeau did not like this, because he passed the law specifically for SNC-Lavalin. So he put a lot of pressure on Wilson-Raybould to try to change this, and when she resisted, she was demoted. Then this came out that she was being heavily pressured and then demoted when she refused, and then she quit publicly, and this became a big stink. Now, this seems very similar, I know what you're all thinking right now. It's like, how is this different? The key difference here is Smith, as the premier, is entitled to ask questions. Same with Trudeau. If Trudeau went to Wilson-Raybould and asked her, why are you not taking a deferred prosecution agreement? I think you should for XYZ reasons. That's fine. He didn't do anything wrong. That's what Smith did. What made Trudeau's case wrong on the first level is he didn't take Wilson-Raybould's response, that is, no, and he fired her and replaced her with someone who would do what he wanted. That's step one. Step two, because even that could have been permissible in certain circumstances. If, let's say hypothetically, we had a law on the books, and this law was, if you help a grandma cross the street, you get the death penalty. Like, wildly ridiculous, wildly over-exaggerated, wildly punitive, wildly capricious. Like, why are we punishing people for helping grandmas cross the street? That's ridiculous. If you had a law like that, and someone was being charged under it, and you as the prime minister were like, we shouldn't be executing people for helping grandmas cross the street, that's insane, and you try to get your justice minister to do something different, you've passed a new prosecution guidelines so that this isn't the main law anymore, that there's alternatives. We can, instead of, you just get a slap on the wrist. Don't help grandmas cross the street. This is not a great example, but you get the picture, right? It's completely capricious. It doesn't make any sense. Then in that case, firing the justice minister and getting a different one who will change the prosecution makes sense and is just and is good. That wouldn't be a bad thing. If SNC Lavalin committed corruption and the penalty for corruption was dismembering the company, it's dissolved, everyone loses their job, everyone in the entire company is sent to jail and is fined $10,000 or whatever. If it was something insane like that, he wouldn't have been in the wrong. Why he was in the wrong, though, was SNC Lavalin committed a serious crime that Canadians do not like, corruption, and Trudeau was trying to get someone who committed a serious crime that Canadians do not like and not charge them for it. Or at least charge them significantly less. In the case of Smith and Arthur Pawlowski and every other people charged with COVID regulatory violations, trying to seek different persecution for them is not just okay, it's not just acceptable, it's morally good. Because, in the case of Arthur Pawlowski, charging a pastor for having church service is insane. That is capricious, vindictive tyranny. It is completely and utterly unjust treatment. Political intervention to stop capricious, whimsical tyranny is morally good. That is a good thing to do. So not only did she not fire her justice minister for refusing her demands, and you can't even really call them the demands, she asked a question, and then when she was told it cannot be done, she stopped asking it. Not only did she do that, which is the correct thing to do, in normal career, in normal pathways, in non-emergency circumstances, that is the correct thing to do. Not only did she do that, but her request to begin with was morally good because she was trying to not get someone who did nothing wrong charged for a nothing. That is a morally good thing to do. That's why this scandal is a complete nothing. It's not a scandal. She did nothing wrong. The reason why you are seeing it pushed as a scandal is because the NDP needs it to be a scandal. They want it to be a scandal. They crave that it is a scandal. Because the only way the NDP wins is if the UCP voters think Smith is like Trudeau. Or, in other words, like a whimsical tyrant who doesn't know what she's doing, doesn't care what she's doing, she's just violating the law, she's inept, she's stupid, or whatever you want to call her. That's how the NDP wins, by demoralizing and depressing the UCP voters. So they will always be pushing character assassination like this, regardless of whether it's true or not, regardless of whether there's mitigating circumstances or not. However, that doesn't mean it matters. This whole affair literally doesn't matter. Not only to people like me who are explaining it and telling you why it's a nothing, but More pragmatically, voters never care about this stuff. We are in 2023. We are so far in the age of social media. We're so far into the age of silly scandals and dumb things caught on camera or caught on audio that are put on the internet, and everyone and their dog can hear it and replay it 9,000 times. We are so far into that. It doesn't matter. You just need to look at Trudeau. Trudeau has committed so many scandals. Actual corruption doesn't affect his voters. He lost some voters initially, and not even that many, I will add. Maybe like 500,000 in 2019. And since then, what has happened? Well, not much. And you could argue possibly a lot of the voters he lost might just be turnout. They just don't really care to vote anymore. And you could argue he should try to get them to vote, but he doesn't need them. So why would he bother? But it's not just Trudeau. You also have Doug Ford, who has the exact same thing. Do you remember back in the fall, the whole big stink about him trying to force back to work and using the notwithstanding clause? Look at his polling now. His polling's fine. He's polling just perfectly fine if he wants another majority. In fact, he's polling almost the same way he was polling in the last election. It's almost indistinguishable. There's no inkling that it hurt him. You go outside Canada, you look in the US. Who is the most popular Republican presidential candidate? Donald Trump. He's almost certainly going to win, barring DeSantis or someone else coming in and doing a very good campaign. The Republican primary, I will clarify. And who's committed more silly, dumb scandals than Trump? Almost nobody. And it doesn't affect him. It doesn't matter. Voters don't care. The age of scandal is gone. It doesn't matter. That's the thing you really need to understand about the internet and social media. Scandals don't matter. What matters is the voters you are trying to court to vote for you perceive that you will do things for them. You could be a horrible, terrible human being. You're corrupt. You don't care. You're autocratic. You're totalitarian. Whatever. You could be a terrible person. But as long as the age of the internet, you are giving voters what they want, it really doesn't seem to matter. All that matters is you identify your voter and you give them things that the other person can't give them, that they want. And again, this is why this is a nothing. It's a nothing. It's a nothing. The odds that this actually impacts Smith in any meaningful fashion after the last 6 months is inane. You don't know what you're talking about if you're saying that. And there's really no data to this. The only poll we've had since this started coming out, a Ledger poll over poll, she's up a point. Not a lot. But if she was flat, it would be the fact that she's up at all tells you it doesn't matter. Because if it mattered even slightly, she would at least be flat. Because keep in mind, her vote trajectory in aggregate, not necessarily every poll over poll, but if you look at the body of polls, she's trending upwards, Smith. So, if this affected her at all, you would expect flattening. But no. The most recent Ledger poll, she's still gaining. So it doesn't matter. Of course it didn't matter. Why would it? But with that, I will bid you adieu. I will see you next week with something different. I'm not really sure yet. It depends on if projects get done in time, but I have plenty of ideas, so something will happen next week. If you like the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you think. If you think I'm off base, if you think I'm missing something, if you think I should change some of my assumptions on PCs versus wild roads, by all means. If you want to stay up to date with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter or, well, subscribe to the channel. That's really the best way, and I would really appreciate if you shared it to your friends. But with that, I once again bid you adieu, and I will see you next week.